Welcome back to Hopetales. Today's story begins above Singapore's morning sky, where the world's largest passenger jet faced an explosion so violent it nearly tore the aircraft apart. On the morning of November 4th, 2010, Singapore's airspace buzzed. With its usual rhythm, departures lifting into the sky, arrivals gliding down smooth as silk, and the early sunlight shimmering across the runways. Among the departing giants stood Qantas Flight 32, an Airbus A380, the largest passenger jet ever built, towering above every aircraft around it. With more than 440 passengers aboard, the atmosphere inside was relaxed and routine. People settled into their seats. Flight attendants prepped the cabin, and the pilots prepared for the long journey to Sydney. The Airbus A380 was a marvel of engineering. Its 4 Rolls-Royce Trent 900 engines produced an immense amount of power, its wings stretched farther than any commercial aircraft, and its redundant systems were designed to withstand almost any failure imaginable. To many, it felt like a ship that nothing could sink. To the passengers, it felt like the safest place in the world. At the aircraft taxied for departure, winds were calm and visibility perfect. Pilots reviewed systems, checked engine readings, and monitored the colossal aircraft's smooth climb performance. Everything behaved exactly as expected. Flight 32 lifted off the runway with an effortless elegance, climbing steadily into the warm Singaporean sky. The cabin hummed with the gentle vibration of 4 powerful engines. High above the city skyline, skyscrapers shrank beneath layers of hazy air. The aircraft turned toward its planned route, leaving the coastline behind and settling into a peaceful ascent. Passengers closed windows, adjusted headsets, or scrolled through in-flight entertainment. The early turbulence remained light, the sky remained clear, and nothing hinted at the extraordinary event that was only minutes away. At around 7,000 feet, the aircraft stabilized in its climb. Sunlight poured through the windows, casting soft shadows across the aisle. The A380's engines worked effortlessly, their deep, steady roar blending into a familiar background hum. The cockpit remained calm, with checklists completed and the airplane behaving exactly as designed. But inside the left wing, hidden from sight, one of the engines, engine number 2, was experiencing internal stress far beyond what anyone could detect. A manufacturing defect in a small internal oil pipe had gone unnoticed. With each passing second, the pressure increased, creating microscopic fractures. The engine continued spinning at tremendous speed, unaware that it was nearing a point from which it could not recover. The passengers enjoyed their morning routine, some reading newspapers, some sipping drinks, others drifting into sleep. To them, this was just another long flight, another routine departure. No one sensed the tension building deep inside the engine. No alarms sounded, no vibration warnings triggered. Nothing in the cabin or cockpit suggested even the smallest problem all around them. The bright sky stretched outward like an endless sea. Below, ships scattered across the Singapore Strait. The climbing aircraft pierced through soft layers of cloud, leaving a white trail behind. At approximately 7,500 feet, time seemed to slow as the engine's internal crack reached its critical threshold. Pressure surged, metal expanded, and the flaws that had been hiding inside the engine's heart rapidly multiplied. The components strained beyond tolerance, and then came a moment no one could feel or predict, an instant that would change the fate of Qantas Flight 32 forever. The engine catastrophically failed. A violent explosion tore through engine number 2, sending shock waves across the entire aircraft. Shrapnel burst outward at supersonic speeds. The wings shook violently. Panels ripped open. Sensors flashed. Systems failed in rapid succession. The explosion shattered the stillness of the morning, jolting the aircraft as if slammed by an invisible force. A burst of fire and smoke erupted from the left wing, marking the beginning of one of the most challenging emergencies ever faced by a commercial flight crew. Passengers gasped, the aircraft trembled, and the cockpit instantly became a battlefield of alarms, warnings, and cascading system failures. Flight 32 was no longer stable, no longer predictable, and no longer routine. The biggest passenger jet in the world had just suffered one of the most severe engine failures in aviation history. This was the moment the miracle truly began. The explosion that tore through engine number 2 was not just a routine engine failure. It was a violent mechanical breakup that unleashed chaos across the entire aircraft. What began as a microscopic crack inside an oil pipe had now transformed into a catastrophic event that shook the world's largest passenger jet to its core. In the blink of an eye, the smooth climb of Qantas Flight 32 turned into a desperate struggle to understand the damage, stabilize the aircraft, and keep more than 440 lives safe as fragments of metal erupted outward. The engine's protective casing shattered like a bomb. Pieces of titanium and steel shot through the left wing, punching holes through fuel tanks, slicing hydraulic lines, and shredding electrical cables that ran deep through the aircraft's systems. The wing surface peeled open in several places, leaving jagged scars exposed to the open sky. Smoke, fire, and debris burst into the slipstream as the massive A380 shuddered violently. Inside the Airbus, the impact felt like a sudden jolt followed by unsettling vibrations. The aircraft dropped slightly, then steadied, then shook again as systems struggled to compensate. The smooth hum of 4 engines was broken by the sudden loss of power on the left side. The cabin lights flickered, and the aircraft trembled with a disturbing rhythm unlike anything passengers had felt before. In the cockpit, alarms lit up in flashing reds and ambers, one after another, cascading down the screens like an unending waterfall of emergencies. Critical system warnings appeared faster than the crew could acknowledge them. Important readouts vanished, replaced with caution symbols or blank spaces. Where there should have been clean green indicators, there were now error messages for hydraulics, fuel pumps, electrical buses, and engine controls. It was as if the heart of the aircraft had been wounded, and every organ was crying out at once. Despite losing an entire engine, the aircraft still had 3 functioning ones. But as the minutes passed, it became clear that the explosion had done far more than disable a single power unit. Fuel began leaking from the wing's upper tank, forming a shimmering trail in the sky. Sensors for fuel distribution went offline. The aircraft could no longer accurately measure the exact amount of fuel remaining. The A380's left wing, designed with multiple layers of redundancy, was fighting to stay stable. Several of its control surfaces, the flaps, ailerons, and spoilers, became sluggish or unresponsive because hydraulic systems had been severed. The aircraft drifted off its planned route, forcing the pilots to manually bring it back on course with stronger than usual control inputs. The cabin crew moved with calm precision. Even without knowing the full extent of the damage, they recognized the seriousness of the situation from the sudden vibration, the thick smell of smoke near the left wing, and the passengers' alarmed reactions. They walked the aisles, reassuring the panicked and helping the confused. They checked for loose items thrown by the explosion, secured galleys, and ensured that no one had been physically harmed in the initial blast. Outside the windows, those seated on the left side got the first terrifying glimpse of the damage. Where a sleek engine nacelle should have been, there was now torn metal, exposed machinery, and a trail of white smoke streaking behind the wing. The sight alone was enough to fill passengers with dread. Some stared in disbelief. Others closed their eyes, unable to look any longer. A quiet tension filled the cabin, an unspoken fear that the aircraft might be losing more than one engine. Yet despite the chaos, the aircraft remained airborne. The Airbus A380 was built with layers upon layers of protective design, multiple hydraulic systems, multiple electrical channels, and backup controls meant that even with significant damage, it could still be flown. But Flight 32 was pushing the limits of those redundancies. More than 650 wires had been cut or burned. Dozens of systems were offline or compromised. Warning after warning continued to flood the cockpit. One of the biggest concerns now was the aircraft's weight. The A380 had only just departed Singapore, meaning it was still heavy with fuel, far too heavy for a safe landing. Under normal circumstances, the pilots would initiate fuel dumping to reduce weight. But the explosion had damaged the fuel jettison system as well. The aircraft could not get rid of the excess fuel. This meant that if the aircraft attempted to land in its current state, it would hit the runway with a force far beyond normal landing limits, risking landing gear collapse, blown tires, or worse, structural failure of the wings. Still, circling for hours to burn fuel was not an option. The fuel imbalance caused by the leak made the aircraft unstable. The damaged wing had lost lift efficiency, making long-term flight risky. The longer they stayed in the air, the more unpredictable the situation would become. Qantas Flight 32 needed to land, but landing would come with its own dangers. The aircraft turned slowly back towards Singapore. Even this simple maneuver strained the damaged systems. The A380 dipped and drifted during the turn, forcing the crew to apply careful, continuous corrections. The aircraft's computers worked to balance airflow over the wings, but the missing engine and structural punctures made the job nearly impossible. Below, the vast expanse of the Singapore Strait glimmered in the sunlight. The skies remained calm, but inside the wounded aircraft, the tension was growing. Despite the visible damage, the passengers knew only part of the truth. They felt the tremors, heard the unusual noises, and sensed the seriousness in the crew's movements. Yet they did not know that the aircraft had narrowly avoided catastrophic structural failure. As Flight 32 approached Singaporean airspace again, air traffic control carefully cleared the surrounding skies. Emergency services began preparing on the ground, anticipating the possibility of a hard landing or runway fire. Inside the aircraft, the atmosphere had changed completely. The earlier peace was replaced by a quiet, heavy suspense. Passengers sat rigidly, some gripping armrests, others praying silently. Flight attendants remained composed, projecting calm despite the internal uncertainty. The A380, once the world's most powerful passenger aircraft, was now limping through the sky, damaged, wounded but still flying. Every mile closer to Singapore brought the passengers toward safety, but also toward one of the most challenging landings any crew had ever attempted. The miracle was still unfolding, one decision, one correction, one moment at a time. The situation inside Qantas Flight 32 was now far beyond a normal in-flight emergency. As the massive A380 continued across the skies above Indonesia, the crew faced a problem no pilot in commercial aviation had ever dealt with before. A perfectly functioning aircraft that had suddenly transformed into a wounded giant, fighting against itself with every passing second. The explosion of engine number 2 had not simply disabled one power plant, it had unleashed a chain reaction of mechanical failures that spread like a shockwave throughout the aircraft's systems. The A380, famous for being one of the safest and most technologically advanced aircraft ever built, was now running with dozens of warnings. The airplane's flight computers continued generating new alerts, stacking on top of the previous ones until the screen resembled a wall of red. Each alert was critical. None could be ignored. And yet handling them all seemed impossible. The crew realized that the aircraft was no longer responding like a normal A380. Controls felt heavier, electrical loads fluctuated, and fuel quantities decreased at a rapid and unpredictable rate. Hydraulic indicators showed pressure loss in several areas, meaning control surfaces might not move when needed. The aircraft that once flew with elegance now felt like it, demanded force and constant correction, as if the pilots were fighting the airframe itself just to maintain level flight. Deep inside the wing, the damage continued spreading. Hot fragments from the disintegrated engine had torn through wiring looms, punctured fuel tanks, and shattered sections of the hydraulic lines. Even though the fire had been contained earlier, the destruction it left behind was immense. Fuel was leaking, sensors were unresponsive, and the remaining engines were operating under higher stress to compensate for the loss of the second engine. Navigation readings began fluctuating next. Some systems provided accurate data. Others contradicted one another, causing confusion about the aircraft's exact status. Altitude sensors, normally precise, began showing split values. Airspeed indicators jumped slightly, as if the wounded aircraft struggled to keep a stable reading through its damaged sensors. The pilots looked toward the engine displays. 3 engines were still functioning, but they carried a new weight, literally and figuratively. Engine number 3 and number 4 on the right side had to work harder to maintain thrust, while engine number 1 on the left fought to balance a wing that was heavier, punctured and unstable. Meanwhile, the passengers sitting above the damaged wing could still see the exposed holes where metal had torn apart. Hydraulic fluid streaks and scorch marks from the earlier blast stained the white exterior. The wing flexed normally at times, but occasionally dipped lower than expected, responding sluggishly. Even without knowing the full extent of the damage, the visual sight alone was enough to silently inform every passenger that this was no ordinary situation. Inside the cockpit, the workload continued increasing. The pilots were running procedures that normally required full crews and extended time. Yet now everything had to be done while simultaneously flying a crippled aircraft. The complexity was so immense that even the aircraft's automatic systems struggled to interpret what was happening. The A380's highly advanced flight management system attempted to self-correct issues, but the number of failures overwhelmed it. Some warnings cleared only to return seconds later. Others contradicted each other. Even the computer seemed confused by the extent of damage, showing signs no pilot training manual had ever prepared the crew for. Fuel management became another urgent issue. The aircraft had to land with minimal imbalance to avoid a dangerous roll upon touchdown. But with the fuel lines pierced, the system was losing fuel unpredictably. The crew manually rerouted fuel through alternate pathways, paths that were never meant to be used in such extreme circumstances. The aircraft's pumps groaned under the new pressure. Fuel levels dropped unevenly, and the pilots constantly adjusted to prevent the aircraft from listing to one side. Below the aircraft, Singapore air traffic controllers monitored the unfolding situation. Radar readings showed the A380 descending more slowly than expected. The crew was cautious, not wanting to put new stress on the airframe with rapid altitude changes. They had to avoid overspeed conditions, which could worsen structural damage, while also preventing the aircraft from stalling under its heavy weight. Landing preparations began earlier than usual because everything took longer with a failing aircraft. The huge landing gear system, normally supported by complex hydraulics, was a major concern. With hydraulic lines damaged, there was no guarantee the wheels would come down and lock properly. The pilots tested alternate methods, but the feedback was inconsistent. They had to rely on feel, instinct, and partial indicators. Another system warning appeared: automatic braking failure. Then another, anti-skid system compromised. The crew now realized that not only was the landing gear questionable, the stopping ability of the aircraft after landing was equally uncertain. The A380, weighing far more than its normal landing weight due to not being able to dump fuel, would touch down heavier, faster, and with less braking power than designed. The runway in Singapore was long, but the stopping distance required for an overweight landing was even longer. Inside the cabin, the flight attendants communicated calmly with passengers, even though they themselves understood the severity of the situation. They walked through aisles, checking seat belts, securing loose items, and preparing travelers mentally for an unusual landing. The passengers responded with remarkable composure, many holding on to the seats, praying silently, or watching the wing anxiously. As the aircraft approached Singapore, smoke residue and damage on the wing glistened in the sunlight. The surrounding clouds offered no turbulence, but even smooth air couldn't hide the tension inside the aircraft. Every mile closer increased the urgency. Every second mattered. The crew knew that once they began the final descent, there would be no second chances. If landing gear failed, if braking systems collapsed, if the heavily damaged wing structure couldn't withstand touchdown forces, the consequences would be catastrophic. But they had no choice. They had to land. And they had to land soon, with the aircraft still receiving error messages, with systems barely cooperating, and with passengers bracing for impact. Qantas Flight 32 prepared to enter its final and most dangerous phase, the descent into Singapore. The world's safest and most advanced passenger aircraft had been pushed beyond every known limit. What happened next would define Qantas Flight 32 as one of the most extraordinary survival stories in aviation history. Qantas Flight 32 descended toward Singapore with the weight of the impossible pressing against it. Systems damaged, engines strained, fuel leaking, and hundreds of lives depending on the next few minutes. The A380's massive frame vibrated gently as it cut through the air. But inside the cockpit, every vibration meant uncertainty. The crew monitored every gauge and indicator, knowing that any sudden change could turn this controlled descent into an uncontrollable emergency. The closer the aircraft came to the ground, the more the pilots felt the aircraft resisting predictable behavior. Because of damage to the left wing, lift was uneven. The airplane wanted to dip left, especially as speeds decreased. The pilots countered with adjustments on the remaining engines and the control surfaces that still responded. But some parts of the wing refused to obey, moving sluggishly or not at all. The A380's famous stability was gone. What remained was a heavy, wounded giant trying to stay focused long enough to reach the runway. As the aircraft lined up with Singapore Changi Airport, the pilots realized the landing would not be smooth, could not be smooth. The plane was still far above its normal landing weight, with more fuel on board than recommended for a safe touchdown. Because of the damage, dumping fuel had not been possible. The A380 approached the runway heavier than any emergency landing of its size had ever attempted. The landing gear indicators flickered faintly. Some lights showed green, others were uncertain. The system could not confirm whether the wheels were locked into place. The crew had run backup procedures, but feedback from the sensors remained unreliable. There was no way to know with certainty. What would happen when 500 tons of aircraft met the runway? Inside the cabin, passengers remained silent. Some held hands. Others closed their eyes. Flight attendants secured themselves, trusting the crew but fully aware they were bracing for a landing that no simulator could ever truly replicate. Outside, the runway stretched like a thin gray lifeline waiting below. The final seconds approached. The aircraft crossed the threshold at a higher than normal speed to maintain lift for the damaged wing. The ground rushed upward. The pilots held the controls firmly, guiding the aircraft with precision sharpened only by experience and training. Then the moment arrived. The massive landing gear touched the runway with a heavy impact, sending a shockwave through the fuselage. The tires strained under the force, some bursting immediately due to the weight and pressure. The aircraft bounced slightly but stayed aligned. The pilots applied immediate corrective inputs, keeping the A380 centered. Despite the damage, the landing gear had held, at least for now. But the danger was not over. The brakes, already compromised by damage to hydraulic lines, struggled to respond. The anti-skid system was unreliable, causing some wheels to grip and others to slide. The aircraft began slowing, but not fast enough for the available runway. Smoke rose from the landing gear. Heat built rapidly. The weight of the aircraft pressed intensely onto weakened components. Reverse. Thrust was activated on the available engines, although one side produced far more force than the other. The aircraft pulled to the right. The pilots countered with rudder and aileron corrections, fighting to keep the plane from veering off the runway. The tires, already damaged, suffered under the uneven braking and rotational forces. For long seconds, the A380 continued its desperate battle with physics. The runway raced by beneath it. The end grew closer, too quickly for comfort. Emergency crews stationed along the sides watched with breath held, prepared for the worst. Inside the cabin, passengers felt the strain in every part of the aircraft. The sounds of grinding wheels, the smell of burning rubber, the vibration of metal under pressure, all combined into a moment that felt endless. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the aircraft slowed enough for the pilots to bring it under full manual control. It continued rolling but no longer threatened to overshoot. Gradually, the speed dropped further until the massive aircraft came to a complete stop. Silence followed. A silence heavier than the roar of engines or alarms. A silence filled with disbelief, relief, and the surreal awareness that something extraordinary had just happened. Even though the aircraft was stopped, the dangers were not fully gone. Smoke still drifted from the landing gear. Fire crews approached cautiously. Fuel leaked beneath the wing. Specific areas were still hot from friction and mechanical failure. Emergency responders surrounded the aircraft with foam equipment, prepared for flare-ups. Inside, the pilots completed shutdown procedures carefully. With so many systems damaged, even turning off the engines required deliberate steps to avoid triggering electrical issues. The flight attendants waited for instructions, maintaining calm, even though they knew how close the situation had come to disaster. Eventually, the all-clear was given. Evacuations were not required. The cabin remained intact, the fire risk was contained, and all systems, though damaged, were stable enough for passengers to disembark through mobile stairs. Hundreds of passengers stepped out into the humid Singapore air, many looking back at the aircraft with a mix of shock and respect. The left wing showed massive damage, holes torn through metal, burned sections, hydraulic stains streaking across the surface. It was a visual reminder of just how much danger they had been. News of the incident spread worldwide within hours. Aviation experts studied photos of the damage in disbelief. Many expressed astonishment that the aircraft had remained controllable at all. The number of failures Qantas Flight 32 endured was greater than anything seen in modern airliner history. Flight simulators could not replicate that level of system loss because the scenario was considered too unlikely to occur. Yet it did occur, and despite the chaos, despite the failures, and despite the damaged aircraft fighting back in every phase, the crew managed to land without a single fatality. Investigations later revealed the cause: a manufacturing defect inside the Rolls-Royce Trent 900 engine that led to an oil pipe fracture, triggering the catastrophic explosion. Safety improvements followed, ensuring such an incident would never happen again. But the true legacy of Qantas Flight 32 was not the damage, it was the survival. The crew's coordination, training, and calm under pressure turned a nearly impossible situation into one of aviation's greatest success stories. The damaged A380, though wounded beyond repair, became a symbol of resilience, and for the passengers who walked away unharmed, the experience became a reminder of the thin line between disaster and miracle. Qantas Flight 32 would forever be remembered not for its engine failure, but for the unprecedented skill and teamwork that saved everyone on board. It became a miracle written not in superstition but in human courage, discipline, and determination.